Hello, I'm Jonathan Mast, and welcome to this edition of the Sedgwick Podcast. We have another very interesting Sedgwick subject matter expert with us today, Neil Wright, who is Director of Professional Liability Claims for Sedgwick. And Neil, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Pleased to be here and be able to, share some stuff about what we do.
Absolutely. Well, before we jump in, you just give a quick overview of your background, and for us, I know you've been with Sedgwick, but you've definitely made a jump in your geographical location and things. So just want to give everybody a quick overview of kind of your past real fast. That would be great.
Absolutely. So I'm originally from the UK, so I started my insurance career in 2005. I've spent the last 18 years specializing in liability claims. In 2016, I had the opportunity to go out to Australia with my family, working for a competitor of Sedgwick at the time. So over roughly the last 10 years, I've specialized in professional liability claims and all the different varieties of that there is. And then most recently was the head of liability for the Australian business for Sedgwick before moving over to the US with Sedgwick in our professional liability team as a director. So I've been in the US now since April. I'm based in Los Angeles, in California.
Well, we are thrilled to have you here in the States, but know you bring a wide background and rich history. Well, Neil, let's dive in and talk about professional indemnity insurance. It's also referred to as professional liability or errors and omissions. So define this coverage for our listeners, because I know it can get confusing when you're throwing around different terms.
Yeah, sure. And I think in a simplistic way, the clue is kind of in the name. So, people quite often confuse professional liability policies or professional indemnity policies, as they're more broadly known, with general liability. And it's really about the type of people that need those policies. That's the primary difference. So a professional indemnity policy is really intended to cover any liability of an insured who may breach their contract with another person in some way. So typically they are professional people, hence that's why it's called professional indemnity. So examples would be, lawyers, medical practitioners, accountants, architects. So really those experts that, people rely on to provide expert services, and people rely on those people's advice. And often if they make a mistake with their professional advice or guidance, there's financial implications for that. So that's essentially what a professional indemnity policy is intended to do. And where that really differs from general liability policies is a general liability policy is just there to cover a person's liability to the public at large, and I'll go into a little bit more detail later, but that's the primary difference. It's really the nature of the services that are provided to the potential person who might have a claim, and the closeness of that relationship and the degree to which a person might rely on that person's advice or professional services, and what the ultimate outcome or potential liability arising out of those services will be.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and you helped on the other one I was going to ask about, which was general liability and getting those kind of lanes laid out for us. And if we look at the next thing, which is how is the language in professional indemnity policies different than what is seen in the general liability policy, which you laid out very nicely there in the first part?
Yeah, so the primary, there's a couple of very key differences. The first one is, so with any insurance policy, it's referred to in different ways, but it's called an insuring agreement, or some people call it an operative clause. And it's right at the start of the policy, and it's effectively the promise that insurers make to their customers that if something happens, they're effectively saying what they will pay. And then the rest of the policy does a lot of work to define what that actually means in practice. But there's a real key fundamental difference in professional indemnity claims, in professional indemnity policies versus general liability policies, and that is under a general liability policy, there's a requirement that if somebody suffers from the negligence of the insured's actions, there has to be a personal injury or property damage that arises out of that negligence. And the reason for that is to do with the law of tort and the way that the rights that the general public have, if somebody does something negligent and somebody suffers injury, they have a right to pursue that person for any financial loss that arises out of it. But because of the law of tort and the requirements for it, there has to be some type of property damage or personal injury that financial loss is attached to, and they call it a floodgates argument. So if there wasn't personal injury or property damage, the courts would be overburdened with claims. There's such a wide variety of people that can claim for such a wide variety of circumstances. There has to be a line in the sand to prevent the courts just being overburdened with claims. So a typical example I always give when it comes to tort claims under a general liability policy is if you're a contractor that is working on a multi-lane highway and for some reason you cause that highway to be blocked, if that rule in tort isn't there to say that, well, unless your financial loss arises out of injury or bodily damage, personal injury or property damage, then ostensibly anybody who was on the highway for that day that might have been late for an appointment or a business meeting, they could all claim against that contractor, and there would be thousands and thousands of claims. And it's just not equitable or in the public interest for the liability of a person's actions to go that far. So that really restricts, the law is what restricts the cover that's available under the policy, because the general liability policy is intended to cover people's liability at law, and it's not the policy that restricts those claims that can be made. The policy is written to reflect the legal position, whereas within a professional indemnity policy, there is no requirement for any loss to arise out of personal injury or property damage. And that's really, if you think about, if we take an accountant, for example, if you have a contract with an accountant that files your taxes and they make a mistake, the consequences of that mistake will be probably financial loss. You may incur a tax liability because the taxes have been filed incorrectly or a rule hasn't been adhered to. So typically there wouldn't be any injury or property damage as a result of that negligent behavior. So really the language in the insuring clause of a professional indemnity policy refers to financial loss, not personal injury and property damage, because that liability would arise under contract, and that would be the logical consequences of a mistake that might be made by a professional person. It would almost always be, except probably in the rare case of probably medical malpractice is probably an exception to that rule, because if a medical practitioner makes a mistake, that could lead to injury. But in almost most other cases, it would normally be some type of pure financial loss, which can only arise under contract at law and not to the general population. So it's the difference in the legal positions that reflect the changes in the language.
So if expanding on that great definition, and I didn't know a lot of that, so that was really helpful. Who is the target audience for professional indemnity policies, and what are the benefits for having them?
The target policy is really professional people, and it's anybody that provides expert advice or advice where there's an agreement covering a relationship between two parties, and somebody's really going to be impacted financially if that advice is incorrect. So, that could be medical practitioners. It's very common for medical malpractice people to have professional indemnity insurance, professional liability cover in case, and that covers not just, surgeries and procedures. It covers, the types of claims we see in the medical malpractice arena is also, failure to diagnose. People, unfortunately, at times, not being diagnosed when they should have been of certain illnesses, and that can cause onward effects in terms of people's health and their financial position in terms of additional medical bills. But yeah, aside with the medical side of it, just set aside for a moment. You'd be looking at lawyers. We do legal practice liability here at Sedgwick. So, lawyers acting for people in personal injury claims in respect to, property transactions. If the title to a property isn't assigned correctly, architect's liability. Sometimes if a mistake has been made by an architect, it can lead to increased building costs to correct the mistake later. So that's another good example. Engineers. So typically people that have a degree, at least a bachelor's degree level background, and somebody that would need to be licensed in order to do the job that they do. So insurance brokers is another example. That, they need to carry a certain license, and if they fail to set up someone's insurance arrangements correctly, that can lead to financial loss for that person if they're not adequately covered when it comes to the claim time if something happens. So they're just some examples. It's really that closeness of that real reliance on someone's expertise and then the potential financial consequences thereof if something happens later.
Well, that leads us to the most consequential question, which is when there is a claim, how do our experts at Sedgwick, one, help clients reduce costs, two, maximize resources, and three, achieve financially sound professional indemnity programs that help them the most?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to exposure to these types of claims are very, very complex in terms of coverage. It's important to understand. I think if you're dealing with a professional person such as the legal industry, it's important to understand that industry as well, not just the specific nuances of a claim. It's important to understand the market as a whole. So where we specialize in professional liability, we have divisions within professional liability itself that are assigned to these industries. So we do, professional medical negligence, healthcare liability. We have a team that specializes in legal practice liability. We have teams that deal with environmental liability. So, and it's really that specialism in those markets that give us kind of an insight. We can really understand the issues that the insured are experiencing and their insurers are experiencing on being in that claim with them. Having that specialist knowledge, I think, is really critical to getting good outcomes for our clients. Most of our staff in our division have a legal background. Many have practiced law, and we have nurse practitioners in our medical malpractice team. So, it's really applying very specialist knowledge to the circumstances of the claim and being able to understand the claim from the insured's perspective because of the similar backgrounds of the claims handlers to the insured who are experiencing a claim. And the other ways we help, we do a lot of analytics for our clients. So for the insurers that we handle and the insurers we handle claims programs for, we're able to analyze loss data and identify trends through our proprietary software, which really helps our clients manage their portfolios in terms of risk, understand trends and patterns in the types of claims they're receiving, whether that's kind of a certain type of, for example, a certain type of law that's generating a lot of claims because of industry trends, or whether it's a geographical thing. It really helps. We feed that information back to our clients, and that can help them make better underwriting decisions in the future. So it's more that's the preventative side of what we do. It's not always just reactive in dealing with the claim. We can use that data to reduce risk for our clients in the future.
That all makes a lot of sense. And so before we go, any last thoughts, any advice to our listeners on if they have questions or wondering what to do next? Obviously, they can visit Sedgwick.com. But any last thoughts, any final pieces of wisdom before we close out, Neil?
I think I just think education is important. I think quite often we see clients they'll write business, and obviously they get the right expertise when claims happen. But I think proactivity is key. I think really understanding the market and partnering with claims people before programs are written, I think is, in my experience, I've been kind of in the market for 18 years now, and I think where I've seen those programs that have really taken a proactive approach to risk reduction and risk and handling claims, those tend to be, you see better outcomes over the long run when it's more of a proactive approach. So, we always are happy to provide advice in advance and, work with potential clients to look at how we can actually help them reduce their risk before their programs go into place. I think being prepared is better than, a better preparation plan is always better than a good reaction plan. So I would encourage anybody that does write professional indemnity insurance to really, from a claims perspective, although the claims function is always very separate to the underwriting function, to really think about that collaboration early and how they can set that program up for success from the outset.
Well, Neil, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, and we certainly look forward to having you on again. I know you have a lot of expertise, and there's more that we can dig into, so many topics, and I think our listeners will want to join us. But otherwise, thanks for being here, and
my pleasure.
We look forward to having you bet. And to our listeners, we will talk to you again soon on the next podcast.